grade was going to completely scar your kids for life. The year was 2001. We were in a hospital in Changsha, the capital of the province of Hunan in China. Now, raise your hand if you've ever been in a Chinese hospital. Paul has. I wasn't expecting to see any hands. A Chinese hospital is not exactly like the hospitals we're used to in the United States. For one thing, it's a lot less expensive. I can't remember exactly how much the treatment cost that day, but I do remember that the cab ride over to the hospital, which was only about 3 blocks, cost more than the treatment at the hospital. I don't know how they achieved these cost savings, but honestly I think that it's largely due to not having, what would we say, niceties that we have in American hospitals. Like things like TVs in the waiting room, things like gift shops and cafeterias, and things like clean sheets on the beds. Not a joke at all, sadly. Now I have 2 kids. My wife and I, we have 2 kids. Our son, Jay, is 21. You know that song back from the 60s? My son just arrived just the other day. He came to the world in the usual way. Well, I think Harry Chapin would be pleased that our son came to us in the usual way. My daughter was different. We first met my daughter Danning when she was about 11 months old. I say about because she was actually found abandoned on the steps of the municipal tax building in Juzhou, China on May 24th, 2000. She was found by a local policeman. Now, it was totally our luck, but this policeman happened to also be an expert in early childhood development. At least I assume he was, because when he wrote the report back at the police station, he wrote down, baby girl found, looks to be about a month old. That was May 24th, so to this day, her birthday is officially April 24th, 2000. Raise your hand if either you or somebody close to you has ever adopted a child. Have you? Where from?
My mother adopted my niece, so infant. But
that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I love adoption. Big fan of it. Thank you. Well, one of the things that they tell you, at least that's what they told us this, is that the baby might be a little bit sickly for a while. I mean, we take our kids to daycare, and you know what happens there. They get sick. Well, imagine what happens if you're living for 11 months in a Chinese orphanage. But when I got her, she seemed to be in pretty good health. I'll always remember that day that we got her. The caregivers came to the lobby of the hotel, and they handed me this little baby, Danny. And I remember looking at her baby face. I still call her that to this day. I looked at her baby face, and I looked at her, this wonderful, beautiful, absolutely ear-splitting tiny package from China. But she was in pretty good health for the first day. But we noticed there was kind of a little sore on her rear end. The second day, the sore was bigger, and she had a fever. The third day, the fever was up to 105. The leader of the adoption group said, you have to get this baby to the hospital. So we did. We took Danny to the hospital. And despite the fact that they didn't have things like clean linens, the doctors seemed to be pretty competent. And so he told me, through a translator, he said, your daughter has a bad infection on her rear. We need to go and work on it. He told me the infection is an abscess 4 centimeters deep. Now, 4 centimeters on this derriere, you wouldn't even see it. But on her tiny rear, that was a big deal. It was just about down to the bone. And so we said, okay, go ahead and operate on, go ahead and work on her. And so we did. And and as he's standing there, cutting with a knife, and digging around with the forceps. She's screaming bloody murder. See, one of the niceties that they had to do without was anesthetic.
Wow.
So I'm standing there as she thought, in her little mind, being tortured by this doctor. And I felt totally helpless. So what did I do? I did the only thing I could do. I patted, wiped, and hoped. Patted her tiny head to comfort her, wiped her tiny nose to keep her face clean, and hoped she wouldn't hate me for life. But the doctor was competent, and after a couple days, her fever went down, and she started to get better. And so that was great. But we were still a little bit tense, because we knew that the following day, we were going to visit the orphanage where Danny had lived. And we really wanted to go. We wanted to see the place, take pictures and stuff. But we were a little concerned, because we knew that she had really bonded closely with her caregivers. And we were afraid that after the experience at the hospital, she would want to stay with them. I mean, not that she could have, but I didn't want to see her go through that heartache. So we carried her in there, and I'm carrying her on one of these carriers. What do they call it? I don't know. Now,
Snuggly?
Snuggly, yeah, something like that, exactly. Nowadays they have a term for this. It's called baby wearing. You heard this term, wearing a baby? So I was baby wearing Danny before it was cool. And we walked into there, and we were surrounded suddenly by all these little short Chinese ladies. Danny was apparently a pretty popular baby there, because they all gathered around, and they're all jumping around excitedly. Dan Dan, Dan Dan. Her Chinese name was Dan Ning, and her nickname in Chinese is Dan Dan. So they're all gathered around, Dan Dan, Dan Dan. But I was a little afraid. What was she going to do? I remember to this day holding her and seeing her tiny face look up at me. And then she looked at the caregivers. She looked back at me again, and her eyes were confused. Looked at the caregivers one more time, and then she turned, and she buried her head on my shoulder. She was our donor. So I go back to the question at the beginning. Have you had a situation where you're afraid that you scarred your kids for life? One thing I've long said, now I can't find it in the Bible, so I don't know that it's true, but one thing I've long believed is that if we're trying to do the right thing, even if we mess up, God will help us. He'll help us out. He'll help us to do it right. If you're in that situation, that you're afraid that you scarred your kids or they're going to hate you, just remember, if we're trying to do it right, God will help you. Someday, you'll most likely feel their head on your shoulder. Is Toastmaster?